love you when you're down, happy when you're up, right by your side when trials come.
Hello viewers and welcome to my rebuttal of the November 2018 JW broadcasting episode. This month's episode is hosted by governing body helper William Malenfant. So without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
Our adversary, Satan the devil, will do all he can to break our integrity and destroy our friendship with Jehovah. Meet Brother Victor Winter. He is a Russian brother who lives in Germany. In 1958, at the age of 21, Brother Winter was sent to a Siberian labor camp simply for practicing his faith in Jehovah. In total, he spent 13 years in multiple Soviet prison camps and 5 years in exile. Despite the persecution, he maintained his Christian qualities.
I was taken to Mordovia. This was the first camp where all believers were put, amongst them 360 of Jehovah's Witnesses. The detentions were very strict because around this time the government and party politics changed. They decided that prisoners must suffer hunger. The food rations were cut. This was very difficult, I must say. And the winters can be cold. Even in March, it could get as cold as 35 degrees Celsius, minus 35. Altogether, during that time, I was in 7 prison camps. I spent about 13 years there and another 5 years in exile in Siberia. But when I was convicted the last time, the head of the interrogation department came into my cell and said, "Victor, when you finish all your prison terms, you will have nothing at all. No family, no children." I smiled at him and asked, "How do you know this, Citizen Lieutenant Colonel?" "I don't know it either, but I do trust in Jehovah." Today, I do have a family and do have my wife, my children. We continue to serve Jehovah. And my greatest joy is when my 6-year-old granddaughter stands next to me in the Kingdom Hall and sings songs that praise Jehovah.
Today, Brother Winter is over 80 years old. What a blessing, as you can see, that he is now surrounded by a big family.
So this is the opening segment of the November broadcast, and there's already so much to talk about. Again, you have this obsession with raking over stories from yesteryear that relate to persecution, or as I've started calling it, persecution porn, to remind witnesses that the organization is being oppressed by Satan's wicked system of things, and therefore it must be God's one true organization, because if there was no persecution, then it wouldn't be fulfilling various prophecies. The organization really seems to delight in any evidence that they can scramble together of anything that can be portrayed as persecution. And, let's be honest, this was persecution. This man was apparently, along with many other Russians, singled out for his religious convictions because he was living in a totalitarian, under a totalitarian regime where only certain forms of religion were tolerated, which seems to be the case again today in Russia. But clearly not all countries are like this. And clearly, rather than this being a case of satanic persecution, this was one country, or one of a number of countries, shall we say, to be more accurate, that had a brutish leadership that oppressed religious minorities. And Jehovah's Witnesses are by no means the only religious minority in history that has suffered persecution. There are many, many examples, even in the modern day, of people being picked on and oppressed and bullied and even killed for having the wrong religion. But what's also interesting is the part about Victor's family, because it homes in on this story of him being told that he'll never grow old and have a big family around him. And then they make the point, but that's exactly what happened. He's now in his 80s and look at his big family. And there's just this crushing irony that Watchtower misses entirely over and over again, that they themselves have become oppressive. They themselves are a regime that punishes people for their religious convictions, for their conscientious stand, as in the case of apostates like myself. We're not just shunned, we're also stigmatized as mentally diseased. Our families are told that they aren't to even email, they're not to even pick up the phone. If there is one organization in my life that goes around telling people they don't get to have their family in one piece, it's definitely the Watchtower organization. And it's kind of insulting that they don't see the irony there. But it's also sad to see Victor continuing the cycle by indoctrinating the next generation. And you see there the footage of him singing with one of his granddaughters. And again, it's just tragic, isn't it, to see that this is just going to go on and on and on. And probably 50 years from now, because this is talking about events that happened about half a century ago, and probably in another half a century's time, if there is anything left of Watchtower still making videos, you can fully imagine Victor's granddaughter being featured, being persecuted in some way by today's Russian regime. So the cycle just never ends.
Keep conquering the evil with the good. This challenging exhortation was written by the Apostle Paul at Romans 12:21. It's challenging because we live in a world that is alienated from God and the truth, a world that tries to squeeze everyone into its mold.
Again, Watchtower pointing a finger where two can be pointed straight back. If anyone, in my experience, is interested in pushing people into its mold, in molding people into a new personality, in changing the way people think, in changing the way people interact with their family members even, it's got to be Watchtower. And yet they're quite happy to point the finger everywhere else and say, oh, they're manipulating. We would never manipulate. But it's also interesting to see this black and white thinking, this scaremongering of telling millions of witnesses who are watching this, assuming there are millions of witnesses watching this, I think there are, of warning them that Satan's world is out to get them and they're not safe and they need to listen to the organization if they're going to make it through.
The faithful man Enoch was born when Adam was about 600 years old, which means that Enoch and Adam were contemporaries for about 300 years. However, there is no record of any contact between them during that period of time. The scriptures indicate that violence and hate for God were widespread in that pre-flood world. Many centuries later, the disciple Jude describes the fear-inspiring prophecy that God gave to Enoch about Jehovah coming with his holy myriads, legions of mighty angels in battle array, to bring destruction to all the ungodly. Enoch fearlessly went about declaring the coming judgment and destruction, and what is more, he did it alone. The prophecy was fulfilled in the global deluge, and it set the pattern of a greater destruction yet to come.
First of all, I'm not entirely sure what point William Malenfant is making when he talks about
Enoch and Adam were contemporaries for about 300 years.
If you're watching this and you're unfamiliar with Christian fundamentalist views on ancient history, let me just fill you in briefly. If you take the ages attributed to Bible characters from Genesis literally, then Adam lived to an insane age into many hundreds, and so did his offspring, right up to, in fact, after the flood, even you will have people like the patriarchs living to insanely old ages. And the ages get shorter and shorter and shorter until finally they level out at 70 or 80 for everyone else. But it's William Malenfant is making this insane point, which I just don't understand the relevance of in the discussion of Adam and Enoch being contemporaries for a period, and then he just switches to talking about how Enoch had this message of judgment, and he brings in this other verse which is some kind of prophecy about how the judgment of Noah's flood involved legions of angels in battle array. Why would there need to be legions of angels in battle array when everyone's drowning? What's the point of them being there? They can just watch everyone drown. I don't understand what involvement the angels need to have if every living thing, apart from a family and some animals in a floating box, are literally being drowned by their creator. So that's a bit odd.
Enoch's example gives us courage to remain firm for true worship, even if family and friends stand apart from us. Enoch did not try to fit in with the evil crowd of the pre-flood world. And we don't want to fit in with the present dying world and its evil ways. We may feel alone at times, but we are reminded that Jehovah never abandoned Enoch, and neither will he abandon his faithful servants today.
We don't want to fit in with the present dying world and its evil ways. This is, what crazy things to be saying. And bear in mind, some are going to be watching this who haven't been indoctrinated as JWs, because they play these things actually at the meeting. So you could be attending a meeting, a Jehovah's Witness meeting, as someone who isn't a believer, and this video could pop up, and suddenly you're coming face to face with this extraordinary language, which again is black and white thinking, is scaremongering, is trying to make people terrified that Satan's world is trying to manipulate them, that there's this pressure to fit in, when again the only pressure that Jehovah's Witnesses are facing is pressure that's coming from their leaders. If anyone is demanding that Jehovah's Witnesses fit in and fall in line and take on the new personality, it's Watchtower and the governing body.
We imitate Enoch by not allowing the evil surrounding us to undermine our faith in Jehovah. Like Enoch, we can conquer the evil with the good by avoiding bad associations, sticking close to Jehovah God in the earthly part of his organization, and boldly proclaiming the good news.
And that's what it's really all about, isn't it? Sticking close to the earthly part of Jehovah's organization. In case you're wondering, what William Malenfant is saying here is extremely correct language about how you're supposed to refer to the organization. So usually you'll hear the Jehovah's Witness religion referred to as Jehovah's organization quite frequently. But if you want to be absolutely correct, as I learned when I went to MTS, the correct way of saying it is the earthly part of Jehovah's organization, because the thinking goes that we're just the earthly part, there's also a heavenly part. which is invisible and controls the earthly part in ways that we conveniently can't see. But again, what extraordinary rhetoric, talking about bad association, resisting and avoiding bad association. Earlier, he also referred to not being put off if family members don't worship or something along those lines. Again, really drawing lines in the sand and making it very clear to witnesses that their loyalty should be with the organization. And if anyone isn't supporting the faithful slave, well, they're to be ignored. We're talking really divisive ideology that's meant to stigmatize anyone who isn't supportive of the leadership and remind witnesses where their loyalty should lie, and that under no circumstances are they to deviate from what's expected of them.
Like Elisha, we want to do what is good for people, including those who do not view us favorably. When tragedies such as fires, floods, earthquakes, and hurricanes strike, we go out of our way to comfort people with the Scriptures. Also, Jehovah's Witnesses serving as relief workers are well known for the practical assistance they render to fellow believers and to others.
William Malenfant basically lies when he talks about the disaster work. It's 95% for the purpose of helping fellow believers, Jehovah's Witnesses. And what's to be proud of there? How is it something that you should be proud of if you're literally just helping people according to whether they agree with you or not? Oh, if you share my beliefs, I'm going to give you some charity. If you don't share my beliefs, I'm not really interested. That's the Watchtower approach to disaster relief.
In his letter to Titus at chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, Paul gives reminders on how Christians today can conquer the evil with the good by showing proper respect for governmental authorities wherever we may live. He writes, "Continue reminding them, fellow Christians, to be in subjection and to be obedient to governments and authorities, to be ready for every good work, to speak injuriously of no one, not to be quarrelsome, but to be reasonable, displaying all mildness toward all men." Paul was a spiritual man, and he conquered the evil with the good by following Jesus' instructions at Mark 12:17 of giving Caesar's things to Caesar, but God's things to God.
If only Watchtower could follow its own advice and comply with reporting laws when it comes to child sex abuse. Honestly, how much hypocrisy can you have in just a few words? Here, Watchtower has the gall, through one of its governing body helpers, William Malenfant, to lecture Jehovah's Witnesses on the importance of obeying governmental authorities, on the importance of paying Caesar's thing to Caesar, literally just a few weeks after the organization has been fined $35 million by a jury in Montana for flouting the law in a state where it was required to report all accusations of child sex abuse. The organization rode roughshod over what the regulations were, and as a result, children ended up getting abused by a monster, and it was all because of Watchtower's callous approach to child safety, to child safeguarding. How can Watchtower have the cheek to lecture everyone on the importance of upholding the law when they, not only do they not uphold the law, but they go above and beyond in their apparent enthusiasm to put their own policies and their own distorted view of the Scriptures ahead of the pressing need to protect children.
Jehovah is the one who judges righteously. However, the Jewish religious leaders did not judge the Christ righteously. They insulted Jesus frequently and even accused him of having a demon. Jesus did not stoop to return evil for evil, hurling insults or threatening people. Insults and threats do not open hearts to accept the good news.
If you were tasked as a JW Broadcasting host with packing as much hypocrisy as possible into your speech, you would struggle to improve on what William Malenfant is saying here. Insults and threats do not open hearts to accept the good news. I'm sorry, but everything about Jehovah's Witness theology, particularly the theology that relates to convincing people to join, to convincing people of the urgency of joining, relates to threats. I mean, think about it. You are threatened with annihilation at Armageddon if you do not join this religion. How can he say that it's not about insults and threats, especially when people are threatened with punishment if they change their minds, if they ever feel differently, if they ever figure out that actually this religion's not for me? Oh, well, we're going to remove your family from you. We can arrange that very easily. So you think again. And insults, you're mentally diseased. You're a mentally diseased apostate. You speak gangrenous words. You eat at the table of demons. I'm not exaggerating. These are all things that have been said about apostates. And here William Malenfant has the cheek to tell us that insults are bad and threats are bad, and that's not going to win anyone over. Well, why doesn't Watchtower put into practice what it's actually preaching here?
We do our best to imitate the Christ by applying the Spirit-inspired counsel at Romans chapter 12, verses 17 and 18. Return evil for evil to no one. Take into consideration what is fine from the viewpoint of all men. If possible, as far as it depends on you, be peaceable with all men. Heeding this counsel is particularly important in homes that are religiously divided. The Christian mate resists the temptation to repay an unkind word or act with another unkindness. Really, no good comes from returning evil for evil. On the contrary, such an attitude can only aggravate the situation.
Watchtower is all about returning evil for evil. Watchtower is all about vengeance and revenge and spite and vindictiveness, especially in the case of anyone who stops believing. How can they possibly have the gall to tell witnesses not to return evil for evil? And it's interesting as well when it quotes from Romans 12, 17 and 18. It says, take into consideration what is fine from the viewpoint of all men. I think most people who aren't Jehovah's Witnesses, if pressed, would consider it very important to protect children, would consider it urgent to report any accusations of child sex abuse to the authorities. That would be a fine thing from the viewpoint of all men. So why aren't they doing that? If it's about how other people perceive things, if it's about doing things properly according to the consensus, why aren't they accepting the recommendations of the Australian Royal Commission and making urgent changes to their woeful and reckless policies on child sex abuse?
In the domestic setting, a wife who shows genuine kindness to her husband after he makes unpleasant comments about her beliefs may well diffuse a potentially explosive situation. At Proverbs 31:12, we are told how a capable, God-fearing wife deals with her husband. She rewards him with good, not bad, all the days of her life.
So interestingly, William Malenfant has decided to focus his attention on women, on wives. He's got some advice for you ladies. Not for men, interestingly. He's not so interested in husbands who have unbelieving wives. No, he's interested in dishing out advice to women. It's a one-sided thing, but it's not sexist. And he starts by talking about this scenario about women who have an unbelieving husband. Now, this has some rather disturbing connotations, the advice he's giving here. He's referring here to unkind words. So an unbelieving husband who's basically making fun of the beliefs of a Jehovah's Witness wife. And he's saying, well, by treating him well, you'll win him over, and he'll be impressed by your good Christian behavior and your respectful, subservient attitude. If you follow my channel, you can understand exactly where this is going. This is precisely the advice that gets given to women who are in abusive relationships. In fact, we had a very recent example of that in an appalling Watchtower magazine that basically encouraged women in this situation who are being abused by unbelieving husbands. They were essentially told to endure the situation because there's no way out for a Jehovah's Witness wife in that scenario, because once you're married, that's it. You can't get out unless there's adultery. So you might as well take the punches, is Watchtower's advice to women in that situation. They're so proud of their policy that they've even put it in print again in this recent Watchtower magazine. And you see the similar thinking in what William Malenfant is saying here. And we're going to return to this subject later in this JW Broadcasting episode. But I also just want to go back to what he was saying about a capable wife.
At Proverbs 31:12, we are told how a capable, God-fearing wife deals with her husband.
It made me look up Proverbs 31. It's actually Proverbs 31 verses 10 to 28 that talk about a capable wife. And when you're a JW, you just read it and think, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, I suppose women should be capable, especially if they're married. You know, last thing you'd want is a wife who isn't capable. So, and it's not sexist to think that. So it's totally fair, I guess, that women are singled out here, and not at all a sign that the Bible was written by men. But when you look up Proverbs 31, having woken up from all that and no longer viewing the Bible as this shining beacon of wisdom and morality, it's appalling. I mean, verse 10 says, "Who can find a capable wife? Her value is far more than that of corals." So she has a value. She's like a commodity. Verse 13, "She obtains wool and linen. She delights to work with her hands." You keep busy, wife. We need you to make things with wool and linen. "She is like the ships of a merchant, bringing her food in from afar. She also rises while it is still night, providing food," modern application, "providing sandwiches for her household and portions for her female servants." You need to make food, women. That's what you're here for. "She sees that her trading is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night." We want you to work through the night. If you're not, if you don't have your light on through the night and you're not busy making clothes or cooking, sorry, you're just not being capable enough. Her hands, verse 19, "Her hands seize the distaff." Are you seizing the distaff, ladies? That's what we need to know. "And her hands take hold of the spindle." Some innuendo, I reckon, thinking about it. I'm pretty sure this is meant to be, two meanings. Verse 21, she does not worry about her household because of the snow, for her whole household is clothed in warm garments. Yeah, you get to the shops and you make sure that your household has clothes. Verse 24, she makes and sells linen garments, and she supplies belts to the merchants. Okay, merchants always need belts, I guess. And verse 27, she watches over the activity of her household, and the bread of laziness she does not eat. Yes, you ladies, don't be lazy. Make sure you are serving your husband and serving your family in all of the ways discussed. I mean, you read it now and you think, how could I not see how sexist all this was? And yet William Malenfant is celebrating this. He quotes from it. He basically is telling women to look up this verse and read it and check the list. This is what the organization is all about. It's entirely, well, first of all, it's all man-made. It's all dreamt up. It's a theology that has just been invented in the murky past and is being kept alive on life support into the 21st century. But it's a theology that's been dreamt up by men who see themselves as the vehicles of God's wisdom, and it's for women to just tag along, to just follow along and be grateful that they have the opportunity at some point to be a capable wife who can support their witness husband.
Additionally, by taking into consideration what is fine from the viewpoint of all men, Jehovah's people have often overcome prejudice by providing practical assistance to their neighbors as opportunity affords, and particularly when a disaster strikes.
Again, that is simply not what happens. Jehovah's Witnesses do not have a reputation for helping out everyone when disaster strikes. They look after their own. They supply only fellow believers with assistance and aid, and only on occasion do they extend any aid to non-believers. And quite frankly, even in instances where Jehovah's Witnesses do help non-believers, if that's being done with the ulterior motive of persuading them that this is God's one true organization and they should totally join, how is that something that's laudable? How is that noble? If you're doing good to people just so that you can convince them to join your organization, how is that something to be proud of? Wouldn't it be better to give assistance to people with zero strings attached?
We conscientiously adhere to Romans 12:19, which states, "Do not avenge yourselves, beloved, but yield place to the wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says Jehovah." The footnote on verse 19 shows that Paul is telling us to yield to God's wrath or anger. Jehovah is the one who will set matters straight, and he will do it much better than we ever could. As James 1:20 states, man's anger does not bring about God's righteousness.
There's now multiple instances in this one speech of William Malenfant saying things where it's a case of do as I say, not as I do. Where it's a case of Watchtower preaching things that they themselves don't put into practice. And here he's talking about how it's important not to avenge yourselves. It's important to yield place to the wrath, for it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says Jehovah. And he even says Jehovah's the one who's going to set matters straight, and he's going to do it far better than we ever could. So we never take vengeance. We never lash out. We never react. We just let things carry on. That is just not how things work. Those who stop believing as Jehovah's Witnesses and speak out against the lies, against the exploitation, against the abuse that goes on in the religion, they are punished. They have punishment exported onto them even years after they've stopped believing, by having their family weaponized against them through the shunning policy. That's one way in which Watchtower exacts vengeance on people. I could also talk, which I probably will do in another video, I could also talk about how Watchtower is increasingly becoming litigious in the way it goes after apostates. And I need to be careful here, because there's things I know about which I'm not at liberty to discuss yet. Even things including me, about how Watchtower has behaved in a very threatening, menacing, vindictive way against those who are actively involved in exposing Watchtower. One example I can talk about two examples, but there are more. In Germany, in Austria, a friend of mine, Misha Verele, has written a book, Goodbye Jehovah. It's in the German language, so I'm afraid I can't tell you how good it is, although I believe it's very good. If you're a German speaker and you haven't read this book yet, please seek it out. Watchtower is suing his publishers because of the criticism in that book. And they've said that it's incorrect. He says things that aren't true, but he's actually explained how actually the things he said are true. It's just that Watchtower is, again, punishing someone simply for speaking out against the organization. So they're literally suing an apostate. I think it's the German branch who are going after Misha, but it's certainly Watchtower that is taking this action. And there's also in Ireland, Avoid JW, the person behind that has been pursued legally by Watchtower, trying to find out his identity, trying to find out the identities of people going to that particular website, and Watchtower threatening legal action because the website is making available publications that you cannot find on jw.org, including elders' letters, including elders' books, including, frankly, just publications that are so old that you can't read them anymore as a Jehovah's Witness unless you do a heck of a lot of digging, or you find an original hard copy on eBay, which not everyone can afford to do. But hey, at least there's this website. Oh no, Watchtower is using its legal might. It's the legal resources of the earthly part of Jehovah's organization are being focused, Sauron-like, on this person whose crime is to make Watchtower's own writings available to people. These are examples, and again I could give you more, of Watchtower lashing out increasingly at apostates. And to be completely honest, again, I'm restraining myself a little bit in what I'm saying, but don't be surprised if they come after me at some point. I'm expecting it. I'm not looking forward to it. I'm not entirely sure what I'll do when it happens, but I'm expecting it. Because we're dealing with an organization that doesn't know how to deal with criticism. It's for many years just adopted this let's bury our heads in the sand approach and just pretend apostates don't exist. But quite frankly, we're winning. Quite frankly, we're having a lot of success at the moment. And as the tide turns and as people begin to leave in droves, which I think, if it's not already happening, will happen, I fully expect Watchtower to get more and more vindictive and more litigious and spiteful, just doing whatever it can to make life miserable for anyone who is exposing the organization. We're already seeing it in the cases I've given you. I expect that we'll see it more But one thing that you cannot say, you absolutely cannot say, which is what William Malenfant is saying, is that the Jehovah's Witness religion isn't interested in retribution, isn't interested in avenging itself, isn't interested in going after its enemies and punishing them, because that's exactly what the organization is already doing.
The theme of this discussion is summarized exquisitely at Romans 12:20 and 21, with this direction to all of Jehovah's people. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap fiery coals on his head. Do not let yourself be conquered by the evil, but keep conquering the evil with the good.
Well, if Watchtower is really interested in living by this advice, I'm open to them giving it a go. But it's certainly not been my experience so far. I would love it if Watchtower could take this approach to its enemies, including people like me who have honest, sincere grievances against the organization. I would love it if they could take the approach of, oh, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. You're heaping fiery coals on his head. And for those not in the know, that's like basically Watchtower's way of saying you're killing them with kindness. You're kind of shaming them by how good you're being to them. Do not let yourself be conquered by the evil, but keep conquering evil with the good. Again, that has just not been my experience when dealing with this organization. I'm speaking out against the organization using the organization's own materials, using logical, coherent arguments. I mean, you be the judge, I guess. And all I'm getting from Watchtower, apart from the things I can't really talk about, is silence and having my family used against me as a weapon. Having my father not be a part of not just my life, not just my wife's life, but also my 4-year-old daughter, Jessica, hasn't met him. And we've got another child on the way who probably also won't meet her grandfather. And it's just abominable. And it would, at the very least I expect is that Watchtower owns up to this kind of behaviour and doesn't shamefully try and misrepresent itself as this loving organisation that treats its enemies well.
In South Korea, 19,000 of our brothers have at some point been imprisoned for their Christian neutrality. But inside the prison walls, our brothers have the support of their fellow Christians. We met a group of brothers who still cherish the friendships they developed while imprisoned, although it's been about 40 years since their release.
When I was 21 years old, I was sent to prison in the Nonsan Military Training Center because I refused to serve in the military. The soldier working in the military prison came and started to beat me, and he beat me relentlessly. It was late December 1975. 4 of the brothers were put into standing solitary confinement cells called dokgochang. It literally feels like you're in a coffin. The outside temperature dropped to minus 13 degrees Celsius, and cold air seeped out from the wet walls. The brothers couldn't lay down to sleep, so they had to crouch, and I could hear them groaning all night. I extended my hand through the iron bars to the brother in the cell next to mine, and he did the same. We held hands and encouraged each other to stay strong.
So this month it's a double dose of persecution porn, a persecution porn extravaganza, if you will. We're now hearing the story of Jehovah's Witnesses who were imprisoned in Korea for being conscientious objectors. And don't get me wrong, I'm appalled at the treatment that these men faced. I think it's abominable. I don't think any country should treat people in that way for taking a conscientious stand due to their beliefs. I absolutely condemn that kind of treatment. If there's anything I could have done to stop it, I would have done that, because quite apart from anything else, these men, in my opinion, were already victims of a cult that had manipulated them into giving their lives in service to the leaders. And as though that's not bad enough, then they have their own government turning on them and failing to show them some kind of sympathy and failing to extend basic rights and going above and beyond in their brutish treatment of these men. So I absolutely condemn that. But there's another side to this story, and quite frankly, I find the timing of this quite extraordinary, bearing in mind that these broadcasting episodes, they're put together months in advance. I would say at least 6 months ago, this episode would have been roughly in its present state, because they have to make the broadcasting episodes available to all of the translation teams. So it's available for about 6 months before it's broadcast. So this has been available since early summer, I would suggest. But even so, the timing is just atrocious, because it was at the beginning of this month, it was at the beginning of November, that there was an article in the New York Times: in landmark ruling, South Korea's top court acquits conscientious objector. Basically, the Korean government is realizing that they've got it wrong, that they cannot simply punish members of a group who take this stand. They need to find a way of dealing with their issues of defending the country, because obviously North Korea is just over the border. They do have a need for a military. They do have a need, you could argue, for conscription, but they need to manage that need in a way that doesn't trample people's rights of religious belief. They clearly haven't got the balance right up to now, when the tide is starting to turn and the Korean government's realizing, oh, actually we're wrong in doing this and we're going to start making things right. Watchtower chooses now, albeit again, this episode's been months in the works, but it's in the same month that we get a JW Broadcasting episode, using this situation as theatre to manipulate witnesses into feeling like Satan's will is out to get them, manipulate witnesses into thinking they're oppressed and they're being attacked. Watchtower loves this, quite frankly. How can they not love it? How would their theology make any sense if there weren't examples of witnesses being oppressed by governments for their beliefs? They need this. But I want to just briefly talk a little bit about the case in Korea, because there's more to it. There was actually, if you read the New York Times article, it's a little bit misleading, because it talks about how there were no other options available. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, you have to fight, or you go to prison. That's the feeling you get from reading the article. But there was actually an article in the Korea Herald. It says in this Korea Herald article, once enlisted, conscripts can be assigned to alternative services, such as working at community centres as support staff. But a month of combat training is still mandatory for all, which is the reason for the conscientious objection. Quite simply, Watchtower has been willing to see hundreds of men go for, I think, up to 2 years in jail simply because they don't want Jehovah's Witnesses doing anything that even mimics going to war. They take seriously the scripture in Isaiah that says they shall not learn war anymore. And they say, well, therefore, you can't even do the basic training. You can't even learn how to assemble and clean a weapon. You can't crawl through mud on these assault courses because that means you're learning how to do war. Just through sheer stubbornness, they are willing to see generations. I mean, in this video, we're seeing men in the 1970s. Think of all the men, not just in Korea, but in other countries as well, who've languished in jail cells as Jehovah's Witnesses simply because of Watchtower's obsessive approach to this issue. That's the side of the story that you're simply not going to hear in these JW Broadcasting propaganda pieces.
A day in the prison started with eating breakfast and then moving 300 bricks. After lunch, we would have to carry another 300 bricks. Because I usually finished my work early, I had a 20-minute break before going back in. However, this brother named Park Byung-man, who was much stronger and bigger than I was, carried bricks all day long. I found out later that Park Byung-man was carrying Che Sung-kyu's share of bricks because of his frail health. This kind of brotherly love really moved me to start studying the Bible. I got baptized a year later in April of 1977 in the Anyang prison.
That's a lovely story, but quite frankly, that's a terrible reason to join a cult. You do not join a religion simply because the followers show love to each other. You get acts of kindness like that all the time if you just listen out, if you just look around you. You do not have to be a Jehovah's Witness or indeed a member of any cult to be capable of that sort of love and kindness.
Even though 40 years have passed, when we look back at those days, the memories are still fresh and we are moved to tears at times. So to make a meaningful trip out of our 40 years of friendship, all the friends who went through the same trials decided to visit the headquarters in the United States together.
It's really refreshing to be here with everyone again today. It feels like I'm taking a field trip.
I was especially moved to tears when I saw our old prison uniforms there in the museum at World Headquarters displayed in the neutrality section.
While on the tour, the brothers sat and lay down on the floor inside the Dokgochang, and we were able to reflect on the times we spent together in prison.
Our gratitude to Jehovah for giving us such loyal friends was renewed.
Call me cynical, but I'm just not buying this story. Okay, so you have these Korean witness men who, again, they've been through a terrible ordeal that shouldn't have happened. But the JW Broadcasting camera crew rolls into town. We're supposed to believe that these men are speaking in front of the camera about their stories, and someone says, "Hey, guys, I've got a brilliant idea. While we're all together, who fancies flying to Warwick in America?" I don't think that's how it happened. I think that this is all staged, and that Watchtower arranged for them to travel to the headquarters because it's fantastic. It's basically a publicity stunt. I think that's how this has happened. But it's just funny how they've tried to make it look like, oh, it's not the organisation doing this as a publicity stunt. This was their idea. They're doing this entirely of their own volition. But then you have the predictable scenes of them going round the headquarters at Warwick, basically having the pain and trauma that they experienced leveraged for propaganda value. And obviously, if you watch my channel, you know that I've already been to Warwick, and I've been in the very room where you see them lying on the floor and where you see the uniforms, the prison uniforms, in glass cases on the wall. And just in case you haven't seen my documentary, just to whet your appetite and encourage you to see it, and also to make a few points about this whole persecution porn phenomenon, I'd like you to watch just a minute or two of my documentary, Warwick, A Journey to My Former Faith. As the tour progressed, almost inevitably, we started to see material about the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses down through the decades. If there is one thing that reinforces the beliefs of witnesses, convincing them that they are suffering as Jesus did, it is random acts of savagery and intolerance from Satan's worldly system of things. But notice you've got here the presentation, If They Persecuted Me. Hasn't that been a central theme of JW theology from the very beginning, about the persecution element and how we must be God's true people?
Yes.
Because we're being persecuted.
Right.
So this is basically a room dedicated to the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. And you have the various uniforms from concentration camps and prisons. When you are a Jehovah's Witness, you rarely stop to ponder that your religion doesn't hold any kind of monopoly when it comes to the persecution of religious minorities by ruthless or despotic regimes, such as the massacre and enslavement of Yazidis by ISIS, or the abominable mistreatment of Muslims in Rohingya, to cite just two recent examples. So please forgive me, but I thought I'd show just that clip because it's quite prescient to what we've just seen in the JW broadcasting, and it's interesting for me to see those Korean witnesses going into that room, the same room that I was in. And again, it's all really for propaganda value. Watchtower, as I said in that clip, needs witnesses to feel as though Satan's out to get them. And this is going to happen to you sooner or later, because the Great Tribulation is coming and you all need to stay loyal. And this is bound to happen because we're God's one true religion. You just hear it over and over again. And even though we've seen two examples of persecution porn in just this JW broadcasting episode, I'm sure it's not the last that we're going to see. I'm sure there are many, many more examples to come in future episodes.
What is a true friend? Where can we find them? And why are they so important? Our music video will answer those questions. It is entitled, True Friends.
Life can be hard if we walk it alone, living in these last days. Jehovah knows that we need friends to help us along the way. But where do we go? Where do we turn to find those true companions? Well, remember what we learned in His Word. True friends love you when you're down, happy when you're up, right by your side when trials come. Speak up if you're wrong, commend you when you're right, keep you on track in the race for life, help you keep Jehovah first right to the end. Yeah, that's a true friend.
Oh, where do I begin? Well, first of all, it sounds like something you might expect from an unholy collaboration between Justin Bieber and Chaz and Dave. Very interesting music. The lyrics are also interesting and quite frankly don't remotely match my experience of Jehovah's Witnesses. Watchtower is in no position to talk about true friendship when friendship among Jehovah's Witnesses is entirely conditional. Your attendance has got to be adequate, because if it isn't, even then you can start to lose friends. That's how paper thin friendship is between Jehovah's Witnesses, and yet here they're saying, oh, they'll always be there for you, your witness friends. But what's interesting is in the lyrics it says, your friends will keep you on track in the race for life.
Keep you on track in the race for life.
When it's talking about being in the race for life, it's not talking about getting by from day to day. It's talking about making it through Armageddon. You're only going to make it through if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses. That's what this religion is all about. And it's interesting that even in its kind of fun music videos, if you listen to the lyrics, you can't help but find these little clues at just how culty the belief system is.
Someone you trust, someone who cares about you, serving Jehovah, a shoulder to lean on, and the right words to help you, man. Yeah, that's a true friend. True friends love you when you're down, happy when you're up, right by your side when trials come. Speak up if you're wrong, commend you when you're right, keep you on track in the race for life, help you keep Jehovah first right to the end.
The lyric, someone you trust, someone who cares about you serving Jehovah,
Someone who cares about you, serving Jehovah.
they can't help but admit in their own lyrics how conditional this friendship is. It's all about serving Jehovah. And a true friend is going to be interested in whether you're serving Jehovah or not, and how well you're serving Jehovah, and will be reminding you that you need to be serving Jehovah. That's what true friendship is, according to Jehovah's Witnesses. Then you have this clip, this scene where this kid is apparently at school in the dining room, and he's got one of those absurd Bible character cards, which was spoken about, I think, in one of the convention talks. This is apparently something that witness kids are supposed to do, is collect the set of character cards that they're supposed to print off from jw.org. And it's not enough for them to just have this kind of weird, culty, embarrassing hobby. They're also supposed to take these cards to school. I mean, whoever dreams up this material just does not know anything about the real world, or how schools work, or how kids react to that kind of thing. They're basically ordering kids to get bullied at this point. I'm sorry, if you turn up to school with these silly cards, you're gonna get a hard time.
What a blessing it is to have true friends around us in the Christian congregation. But at times, our imperfection may create roadblocks between us and our dear friends, and we may start developing negative feelings about them. In this Bethel morning worship, pay attention to how Brother Jeffrey Jackson of the governing body helps us deal with such thinking.
So what do we do? Well, what does it say? Continue putting up with one another. Continue. It's something that we just have to keep on doing. Now that brings us to the second part of our verse, forgiving one another freely. It's interesting when we look at other translations of this verse. Most follow the King James Version and just say, forgive. The New World Translation says, forgive freely. The reason is that this isn't your normal Greek word for forgiveness. It denotes generosity, a willingness to go beyond what's required. It's interesting that the Watchtower, even back in 1882, was using that expression, to forgive one another freely, well before the time of the New World Translation. So this gives us something to think about, because it's not just a matter of forgiving, but we need to be generous about forgiving. We have to be willing to, as it were, bestow a pardon on someone who really doesn't deserve that pardon. So as we come across these things that irritate us, annoy us in life, or if we come across persons who actually do sin against us, what should we keep in mind? Continue putting up with one another. Continue freely forgiving one another.
I personally find it rather hypocritical that they are talking about the need for forgiveness. I mean, not just they, Jeffrey Jackson, as a governing body member, is talking about the need for forgiveness when he and his associates are heading up an organisation that abuses people by arranging for their families to shun them if they do anything wrong. Again, it's a case of Watchtower saying one thing and doing something entirely different. But there's another side to this, and that's I find it quite insidious the way witnesses are here being told to themselves go above and beyond. In other words, this isn't really for the organisation. The organisation needs to implement this advice, but they think that it's actually their followers who need to be more forgiving. Oh, we're fine. The governing body is really merciful already. It's actually you guys, our followers, who need to be more forgiving. And we've seen that there's been actual stories, documented cases of this, where someone molests a child and they are expected to receive forgiveness from the person they've abused. And this advice seems to be being echoed here.
It's not just a matter of forgiving, but we need to be generous about forgiving. We have to be willing to, as it were, bestow a pardon on someone who really doesn't deserve that pardon.
I'm sorry, but this is a fatal flaw in Watchtower's entire culture, especially when it comes to the issue of child safeguarding. This notion that people who sin, including people who rape children, can, under certain circumstances, be worthy of forgiveness, in which case they're only reproved. Oh, well, in that case, you're sorry. You can just, carry on as normal. We'll slap a few restrictions on you, but after a few months, you'll be back up and running and giving talks or answering or whatever. Monsters who abuse children do not need forgiveness. They need jail.
Perhaps your mate is an unbeliever. Differences in belief can cause a level of friction. But how one handles or conquers the situation can bring you peace and even be a great witness.
When I started studying the Bible, I thought Thomas would be as excited as I was to learn the truth. But every conversation we had on the subject seemed to turn into an argument. Looking back, I really wish I'd handled it better. As the years went by, he did become more open to discussion. But it's been hard worshiping God alone. Others in the congregation are able to serve Jehovah together and even reach out for theocratic goals like the School for Kingdom Evangelizers, something I would love to do. Why can't I have a husband who loves Jehovah like I do? Abigail probably felt the same way, but with more reason. her husband was a bully and a drunkard and was despised by his entire household. At that time, many marriages were arranged, so Abigail had very little control over her circumstances. But her words and actions showed that she was a spiritual woman who didn't focus on what she could not control, but what she could. I determined to do the same. I meditated on Jesus' words at Matthew chapter 19, verse 6. What God has yoked together, let no man put apart.
So this for me is the most chilling part of this month's JW broadcasting episode, because what we're seeing here is a rehashing of the same logic, the same ideology that keeps Jehovah's Witness men and women in abusive relationships. This whole idea of what God has yoked together, let no man put apart. If you find yourself in an abusive relationship, tough, you're stuck with it. You made the decision to get married. The only way the marriage is ever going to end is if there's adultery. So it doesn't matter if you're being physically assaulted by your spouse, you need to stay married. And granted, it doesn't mention physical assault. It gives the example of Abigail, and you see him acting drunk and out of control. You don't see him assault her, but nevertheless, it's the exact same logic that we saw in the December 2018 Watchtower, where women who are in abusive relationships, it actually mentions physically abusive relationships. Women in that scenario are told that you need to really endure because divorce isn't an option. You've got to see this through. So it's quite chilling for me to see this kind of propaganda, which will only reinforce the terrible advice that was given in the December 2018 Watchtower. But I also think there's some victim blaming going on here, because you hear when the story of Abigail is being recounted, you hear the woman say, well, in those days, marriages were arranged, so Abigail didn't have much control over her circumstances.
At that time, many marriages were arranged, so Abigail had very little control over her circumstances.
The insinuation being, if you think about it, that she would have been to blame if she'd have chosen her husband without the marriage being arranged. So the message that abused women are getting, imagine if you're a Jehovah's Witness woman watching this, thinking it through, what you're being told is, if your husband is being abusive toward you, you bear some of the responsibility because you chose to marry him. Abigail didn't have any choice. Her marriage would have been arranged, but you're not in an arranged marriage, so therefore you bear some of the responsibility for what's happening to you. This is victim blaming of the most grotesque kind, and it will only serve to help keep abused men and women trapped in physically abusive relationships where their very lives are in danger, and they're being told by the elders, by the organisation, divorce isn't an option, you've got to see this out.
To Jehovah, marriage is permanent, even my marriage to an unbeliever. So instead of dwelling on changing my husband or my marriage, I focused on changing myself. Thomas does not love Jehovah, but he's no Nabal either. He is loyal and he loves me. He is entitled to the respect the Bible commands wives to show their husbands. So I'm making an effort to be more respectful and loving to him. Thomas hasn't developed an interest in the truth or started studying. But I have the satisfaction of knowing my God is pleased with me, and I have the same view of marriage that he does.
How exciting! Is Thomas slowly noticing the benefits of the truth? No doubt Emma's faithful and respectful conduct has had a deep impact on how he views Jehovah.
That's all Watchtower is really bothered about in this scenario of a non-believing husband. How do we rope him in? How do we recruit him? How can wives win over their husband without a word, even when they're in a difficult marriage? And in this scenario, granted, Thomas isn't abusive, but that's kind of the point. She talks about how he's a good man, he's no Nabal, and he loves me and he's loyal. Well, even if he had been like Nabal is Abigail's husband in the Bible, who is described as being a bully. Even if Thomas had been the most foul, violent, abusive husband you could imagine, so long as he isn't disloyal, so long as he doesn't commit adultery, this woman stuck with him due to Watchtower's twisted theology that puts the organization's interests over the need to preserve life, the need to guarantee the welfare of an endangered and abused husband or wife. And so all Watchtower's really interested in this situation is, oh, well, we need to get the husband roped in. We need to recruit the husband, to the point where after the dramatization is finished, William Malenfant is saying, ooh, this is exciting, isn't it? Thomas might be joining. He's slowly seeing for himself how wonderful the religion is. It's such a backward way of looking at the whole issue of marriage. Bottom line, if a marriage isn't working, especially because one of the spouses is abusive, people should be able to walk away and move on with their lives. But again, in this dramatization, it's made very clear that that's not an option. And we even get women who are in this situation, Jehovah's Witness women who are in abusive relationships, watching this particular broadcast, in addition, are getting the message, well, actually, this is kind of your fault to begin with because no one arranged your marriage.
A few months later, I left to study in Germany. It was the first time I met a brother engaging in street work. People would approach him and some would swear, some even spat at him. It impressed me immensely how he stood calmly and accepted this treatment. We had interesting conversations. My studies ended and I returned to Greece to take on the responsibility of the factory. When I finished my studies in Germany, I left with a sense of deep respect for Jehovah's Witnesses. The influence through my friends led me to go in the military. And there I saw a huge amount of corruption. The hope I had that we humans would be able to succeed without external help, without God, began to collapse. And then the things I had heard from Jehovah's Witnesses suddenly came to my mind. The same afternoon, I sought out a family friend, the mother of a childhood friend named Lily. I said to her, please give me a Bible and some Bible study publications because I want to study it. I read everywhere, and anything that I didn't understand, I wrote down in a notebook. I got to the point in just a few days where I had written down 80 to 90 questions. Harry impressed me because every time I asked him a question, he gave me the answer from the Bible. That convinced me that I had found the truth.
So this is a testimonial from two Greek brothers. And when I say brothers, I mean actual brothers, not in the Christian brother sense. They're two fleshly brothers telling their stories of how when they were young, their father committed suicide, and it had a dramatic effect on both of them, and they both went off and did their own thing and got involved in Satan's system of things to varying degrees. And first one became a witness, which is what we're seeing here, and then he convinces the other one to become a witness. I would use their names, but their names are kind of hard to pronounce.
Dimitris and Agis Soteropoulos.
Those names, those are the names I'm referring to. And so these guys become witnesses. And by the end of it, we're going to see how close they are now that they're both in the truth. But I just find it interesting how one of the two guys is here talking about how he left the military and remembered some of the things he'd heard from a witness. And he's saying, I wrote down 80 to 90 questions, and this guy, Harry, he answered all of them from the Bible, so that's how I knew it was the truth. Well, okay, what's interesting is that that's the only time you get to ask the questions before you join. Once you're baptized, any questions you have you must accept the answer from Watchtower, or you're on very dangerous ground. You can very quickly find yourself in trouble if you ask too many questions and don't automatically accept the answers that are given to you by the organization.
Today, my brother and I love each other very much.
It is a relationship characterized by brotherly love, as it is expressed in the Bible. We are very close to each other. This is really a change. Now we are truly brothers.
So again, you have these brothers who are called
Dimitris and Agis Soteropoulos.
What he said, and the impression that's being given is that you only get to have this profound love for your brother or for your family member if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses. That's kind of the message here. Because again, the whole story is about how they pursue their own paths and they end up getting reunited as witnesses. I'm just not buying it, that it's impossible to be close to a brother or a sister if you're not in a cult with them. I'm pretty sure it's possible to have a close bond with your sibling without believing that 7 billion men, women and children deserve to be slaughtered for not agreeing with your religious beliefs.
Let's also briefly visit our brothers and sisters in Portugal. Mainland Portugal has over 800 kilometers, or over 500 miles of Atlantic coast. In the southern part of the country, they have over 3,000 hours of sunshine per year.
Thank you for those facts, which I'm almost certainly never going to need.
Today, the country reports some 49,500 publishers and a ratio of one publisher to about 200 people, one of the lowest ratios in Europe. The ratio is even lower in Almada, which is across the Tagus River from the capital city, Lisbon. In Almada, there are 16 congregations with almost 1,400 publishers in total, with a ratio of one publisher to about 100 residents.
So we're now at the end of this episode, thank goodness. And I just found it fascinating, this brief clip. They're talking here about Portugal. I've spoken about publisher to population ratios in past rebuttals because I find it fascinating that in different parts of the world, you're basically more likely to survive Armageddon just for having been born in a certain country or on a certain continent. How does that work if God is not partial and if God is equally interested in people of every country and of every background surviving Armageddon? Here you have William Malenfant actually talking about the ratios, and he talks about this place in Portugal where you literally just need to cross a river, and if you meet someone, they are twice as likely to survive Armageddon. Just by crossing a river, the survival odds have improved that dramatically. And we're talking here about a ratio of 1 in 100 or 1 in 200, depending on which side of the river you're on. It gets even worse in other countries, as I've explained in previous rebuttals. Bangladesh is a great example. Think of how densely populated Bangladesh is. 161 million people, according to the service year report. And the ratio there is one publisher to 525,084. Jehovah really doesn't like the idea of people from Bangladesh surviving Armageddon. So anyway, that's pretty much everything I've got for you in this month's rebuttal. It's been a remarkable episode. We again had that double whammy of persecution porn. We had William Malenfant saying some things that are just completely untrue and entirely misrepresenting the nature of the organization and the way it approaches its enemies. And we also had that abominable advice for married couples, particularly for women, it seems. They need to stay married no matter what. And when you tie in, again, the December 2018 Watchtower with its dreadful advice for abused women to endure, you just see a really dangerous ideology. This again puts the organization's interests first and the need to preserve human life second. So there's quite a few things to talk about. Hopefully I've done it justice. If you have enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe for more videos. And as always, thank you for watching.